The USS Gerald R. Ford, hull number CVN-78, represents the absolute pinnacle of American naval engineering and is the most expensive warship ever constructed by any nation in the history of naval warfare, costing an estimated $13.3 billion to complete. This nuclear-powered vessel is the largest aircraft carrier in the world, stretching 1,106 feet from bow to stern and displacing approximately 100,000 tons at full load. It carries on board the most advanced arresting gear, the most advanced electromagnetic aircraft launch system, and some of the most sophisticated radar and defensive technology ever installed on a naval vessel. The ship is the product of decades of dedicated design work, billions of dollars of research and development, and the collective expertise of the most powerful military-industrial complex in history. However, despite this technological prowess, the USS Gerald R. Ford has been plagued by hundreds of broken toilets, a situation that has evolved into one of the most bizarre, embarrassing, and revealing stories in recent American military history. In February and March of 2026, as the United States and Israel were engaged in conducting one of the most aggressive military campaigns in the Middle East in a generation, the USS Gerald R. Ford was making global headlines for a reason that no admiral, no defense contractor, and no Pentagon spokesperson could have anticipated. Her sewage system was catastrophically failing. Hundreds of the nearly 650 toilets on board were not working. Sailors were reportedly waiting up to 45 minutes in line to use the few functional facilities. Raw sewage was observed overflowing through the ship's corridors. Hull technicians were working shifts of up to 19 hours a day, attempting to keep the plumbing functional, and the Navy was spending approximately $400,000 per specialized acid flush treatment just to temporarily clear the clogged pipes. This domestic crisis on board the flagship vessel provided an opening for adversaries. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement claiming that the Ford had been forced to retreat from the operational region, gleefully citing the sewage crisis as definitive evidence of what they termed the hollowness of American military power. Iranian state media could barely contain its satisfaction, reporting that the world's most expensive warship was defeated not by missiles or drones, but by a functional failure of a basic amenity. This report examines the complete details surrounding the USS Gerald R. Ford's toilet crisis, analyzing what actually caused the failures, why the issue matters far beyond the initial absurdity of the headline, what it reveals about the complex procurement process that produced a $13 billion ship with a dysfunctional sewage system, and the broader human cost for the sailors who have been living through it. We will establish what is true, what is contested, and how Iran's claims measure against the available evidence. This is a story that combines naval engineering, defense procurement failure, human endurance, information warfare, and the difficult question of what it means when the world's most powerful military cannot keep its most expensive ship's plumbing working during a combat deployment. To fully understand the crisis, it is necessary to establish what the USS Gerald R. Ford actually represents, as the gap between its intended capabilities and its operational experiences is central to understanding why this story is significant. The Ford is the lead ship of the new Gerald R. Ford class of aircraft carriers, designed as the successors to the Nimitz class, which has formed the backbone of American carrier aviation for 50 years. The vessel was laid down in 2009, launched in 2013, and commissioned into service in July 2017. The program was originally projected to cost approximately $10.5 billion, but the final bill came to $13.3 billion, roughly 27% over budget. She is named after Gerald R. Ford, the 38th President of the United States and a former Navy aviator. The Ford class was designed to incorporate a remarkable array of new technologies that would make her more capable and easier to operate than her predecessors. The most significant of these innovations was the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, known as EMALS, which replaced the steam catapults that had launched carrier aircraft for 60 years, with a far more precise and controllable electromagnetic system. She also received the advanced arresting gear to replace legacy hydraulic systems, and a new dual-band radar system combining an air traffic management radar with a volume search radar in a single integrated package. Her island superstructure was redesigned and repositioned to improve flight deck operations, and her reactor plant was redesigned to produce triple the electrical power of a Nimitz-class reactor, anticipating the massive energy demands of future weapon systems and sensors. On paper, the Ford class represented a generational leap forward in carrier capability. In practice, however, the concurrent introduction of so many new technologies simultaneously created a ship that spent its early service life in a constant struggle with systems that did not function as designed. The EMALS was unreliable in its early years. The advanced arresting gear experienced frequent failures. The new radar suffered integration problems, and the sewage system, which was completely redesigned from the Nimitz-class layout, began causing problems almost from the moment the ship entered service. The Ford arrived in the fleet 9 years later than the original schedule, and she did not achieve initial operational capability until late 2021, 4 years after commissioning, and even then, systemic problems continued. To understand why the USS Ford's toilets have become such a persistent and costly problem, it is necessary to examine how the ship's sewage system was designed, and what went wrong with that design. The Ford utilizes what the Navy calls a vacuum collection holding and transfer system, universally abbreviated as VCHT. While this is not a new concept in naval engineering, vacuum-based sewage systems have been standard on large ships for decades. The application here has faced specific challenges. The principle of VCHT is straightforward. Rather than using gravity and large diameter pipes to move waste, a vacuum system uses air pressure differentials to suck waste through smaller diameter pipes to central collection tanks, where it is held until it can be discharged according to environmental regulations. The advantages of a vacuum system are real, theoretically allowing for smaller pipes, less weight, and more flexibility in routing through a complex ship. Properly designed and maintained, vacuum systems can be highly reliable. However, the problems with the Ford's VCHT system stem from several interconnected design and engineering decisions that compounded each other in ways that became fully apparent only under the stress of an extended deployment. The first identified problem is the pipe diameter. Multiple reports, including detailed technical analysis by defense engineering consultants, have concluded that the Ford's VCHT pipes were designed with insufficient diameter for the massive volume of waste they were required to process. The ship carries approximately 4,500 to 5,000 sailors, an enormous population generating a significant volume of sewage daily. The pipes installed to handle that volume were, in the assessment of multiple independent engineers, simply too narrow. The consequences of undersized pipes are predictable, yet were apparently not adequately modeled during the design phase. Narrow pipes clog more easily, are more vulnerable to the kind of calcium buildup that occurs when water with significant mineral content flows repeatedly through a confined space, and they are extremely sensitive to improper use. Items that should not be flushed but inevitably are, such as t-shirts, mop heads, hygiene products, and other non-flushable items, clog the system, as no amount of signage fully eliminates the reality of human behavior when disposal options are limited. The second critical problem is the interconnected nature of the system. Unlike the Nimitz-class carrier design, where the sewage system was divided into multiple, truly independent zones so that a failure in one section did not affect others, the Ford's VCHT system has a design characteristic where a single valve failure can disable all toilets within an entire department of the ship. This is a design flaw of considerable consequence, meaning that what should be an isolated, manageable maintenance incident can rapidly cascade into a scenario where hundreds of sailors in the same area of the ship have no working toilet facilities. The third problem concerns maintenance access. The Ford's VCHT pipes run through spaces that are difficult for repair crews to access. On the Nimitz class, the sewage system was designed with maintainability as a primary consideration, reflecting decades of hard-won operational experience about what matters during long deployments. The Ford's redesign prioritized space optimization and weight reduction in ways that made the plumbing more compact but significantly harder to reach when repairs were required. The fourth major problem is the acid flush treatment that has been the Navy's primary tool for clearing the calcium buildup that causes the most severe and persistent clogs. While this acidic chemical solution is highly effective at dissolving calcium deposits over time, it can only be safely applied when the ship is docked in a properly equipped shipyard. The process requires specialized equipment, controlled disposal of the highly caustic waste product, and access to specific sections of the ship that is not practical at sea. At approximately $400,000 per treatment, this is not a routine maintenance procedure, and because it can only be performed in port, the problem of calcium buildup is one that the crew at sea can manage but cannot fully resolve. The toilet crisis did not emerge suddenly in early 2026. It had been building for years, but it reached its most acute and publicly visible phase during an extraordinary deployment that began in June 2025 and continued through 2 extensions ordered by President Trump, extending far beyond what the crew, the ship's systems, or the families of the nearly 5,000 sailors had anticipated. The USS Gerald R. Ford departed Naval Station Norfolk on June 24, 2025, for what was described as a regularly scheduled deployment. Such deployments typically last 6 months, with ships and crews returning to their home port by the end of the calendar year. The Ford's crew packed for 6 months, their families planned for 6 months, and the ship's maintenance schedule was calibrated for 6 months. However, geopolitical events dictated otherwise. In late October 2025, the Ford and much of her strike group were redirected from their original operational area to the Caribbean as the Trump administration began assembling the military posture that would eventually be utilized in the Venezuela operation. The Ford's crew learned they would not be home by Christmas. In January 2026, the Ford played a central role in American military operations in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro. While specific details of those operations, including the carrier's specific contributions, remain classified, the Ford was there conducting flight operations, supporting the mission, and executing its design purpose. Rather than being sent home following the completion of that mission, the Ford's deployment was extended again as the Iran war began on February 28, 2026, and Washington required the Ford in the Mediterranean. By the time the Ford was heading toward the Middle East in late February and early March of 2026, she had been at sea for approximately 8 months, her crew had been away from home for 8 months, and her systems, including her sewage system, had been operating under sustained stress for 8 months without the routine port maintenance that would normally occur during a standard 6-month deployment cycle. Reporting by the Wall Street Journal in late February painted a detailed picture of the human cost of this extension. One sailor had missed the death of his great-grandfather. Another was considering leaving the Navy after spending almost a year away from her toddler daughter. Multiple sailors stated that the combination of broken toilets, the uncertain timeline for homecoming, and the psychological weight of an extended deployment was affecting morale in ways that went beyond normal deployment stress. Captain David Skorowski, the Ford's commanding officer, acknowledged the strain in a letter to his sailors, writing, "When the country calls, the crew responds," which was an acknowledgement of the heavy demands being placed upon them. Documents obtained by Navy Times confirmed that the Ford was averaging approximately 1 sewage-related maintenance call per day during its 2025 deployment. Internal emails obtained by NPR described 205 toilet breakdowns over a span of just 4 days. Since 2023, the ship had required external sewage maintenance assistance 42 times, with 32 of those calls occurring in 2025 alone. On February 24, 2026, footage circulated showing raw sewage flowing through the Ford's corridors in a significant overflow event. The footage, taken by someone on board and not officially released by the Navy, showed water and waste moving through passageways and prompted a wave of media coverage that transformed a persistent maintenance embarrassment into a global news story. Hull technicians responsible for maintaining the system were working shifts of up to 19 hours a day to keep enough toilets functional to meet basic needs. Sailors were waiting in lines of up to 45 minutes to use facilities that were still working. The ship had been built with approximately 1 toilet for every 7 or 8 sailors, a ratio that had proven inadequate even under normal conditions and became genuinely untenable when significant portions of the system were non-functional. The Ford's transit from the Caribbean toward the Middle East included a port stop at Ceuta Bay in Crete, Greece, in late February and early March of 2026. This stop was operationally significant for multiple reasons. President Macron of France met with the Ford's crew during the visit, delivering a speech emphasizing Western solidarity in the face of the Iran crisis. The visit generated significant media coverage, with photographs of the carrier docked at the Greek base being widely circulated. However, the Crete stop was also, by multiple accounts, an opportunity for emergency maintenance on the Ford's sewage system. The port stop provided the opportunity to address some of the most acute plumbing problems that could not be resolved at sea. While it is not publicly confirmed whether any acid flush treatment was possible at Suda Bay, rather than at a fully equipped American shipyard, the timing of the stop, following the February 24th raw sewage overflow incident, is consistent with a ship that required shore-based maintenance support before proceeding to an active combat feeder. Chinese state media, in reporting that was picked up internationally, noted the Crete stop and speculated about its purpose. The Global Times quoted Chinese military analysts stating that the extended deployment beyond scheduled limits, combined with the crew's failure to use the toilet system according to operating procedures, had seriously undermined the ship's combat effectiveness. This framing, emphasizing both the design failure and the human behavioral contribution to the problem, reflected the broader information environment surrounding the plumbing crisis. We must now address the specific claim at the center of the controversy, that the toilet failure forced the USS Ford to retreat. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement in March 2026 claiming that the USS Gerald R. Ford had been compelled to retreat from the region, describing the carrier's departure from certain operational areas as evidence of what the IRGC termed the hollowness of American military power. Iranian state media elaborated extensively, connecting the sewage crisis with the IRGC's broader narrative of American vulnerability and Iranian resistance. The IRGC's claim highlighted the Ford's diversion toward an American base and described what it called the carrier's desperate attempts to avoid navigating the Bab al-Mandab Strait, the waterway between Yemen and the Horn of Africa, through which vessels must pass to enter the Red Sea from the south. The strait had been the site of sustained Houthi attacks on commercial and military shipping throughout the conflict. The IRGC suggested that the Ford's routing decisions reflected fear of Houthi capabilities rather than operational planning. However, an analysis of the available evidence does not support the characterization of a military retreat. The Ford participated in Operation Epic Fury, launching aircraft against Iranian targets in the opening phases of the campaign, and continued conducting flight operations throughout the period when Iran was claiming she had retreated. The United States Navy never confirmed any withdrawal of the Ford from her assigned operational area in response to threat or damage, and no credible independent reporting corroborated the Iranian claim that the Ford had fled under pressure. Regarding the routing decisions, the situation is more nuanced. The Bab al-Mandab Strait is genuinely dangerous for large warships, and the Houthis had demonstrated the ability to strike vessels with anti-ship missiles and drones. American carrier strike groups had been conducting operations in the Arabian Sea, rather than the Red Sea, precisely because the threat environment in the southern Red Sea was serious enough to warrant caution. Whether the Ford specifically chose to avoid the strait because of the Houthi threat or because of her operational positioning in support of the Iran campaign is not publicly confirmed. The official American position regarding the operational impact of the sewage crisis, stated by Lieutenant Commander David Carter of U.S. Fleet Forces Command, was that the plumbing issues had no effect on operational readiness or mission execution. This is the standard official line, and it is likely substantially accurate in the narrow sense that the Ford was able to launch aircraft, conduct strike operations, and perform its primary mission. However, it is also true that a carrier with hundreds of non-functioning toilets, a crew working 19-hour shifts to manage a sewage crisis, and sailors suffering the morale effects of an 8-month deployment under difficult conditions is not operating at the peak of its potential effectiveness. The human cost was real, even if it did not prevent the ship from completing her assigned missions. The critical question is what the Ford's toilet crisis actually reveals about the state of American naval procurement and readiness, as that question has an uncomfortable answer regardless of one's geopolitical perspective. The USS Gerald R. Ford sewage system crisis is not fundamentally a story about toilets. It is a story about the consequences of developing an extraordinarily complex weapon system under a procurement process that prioritizes the introduction of new technology over the validation of that technology under operational conditions. The Ford class was designed to incorporate more new technology simultaneously than any American carrier in history, including EMALS, the advanced arresting gear, the dual-band radar, the new island configuration, the redesigned reactor plant, and, critically, the completely redesigned sewage system. While each of these innovations was individually justifiable on technical grounds, together they created a ship that was essentially a prototype, a vessel in which so many systems were new and untested in operational service that the inevitable problems of any new design were multiplied across every major ship system simultaneously. The Navy's decision to introduce all of these new technologies on the same hull, rather than incorporating them incrementally across successive ships as the Nimitz class had done, was driven by cost-efficiency logic. Developing and testing new systems across multiple hulls was judged to be more expensive than concentrating all the innovation in a single new class. In retrospect, that logic has proven flawed. The cost of fixing the problems that emerged, the email's unreliability, the arresting gear failures, the sewage crisis, has been enormous, both financially and in terms of the operational readiness of the ship during its early service life. The sewage system specifically reflects a design philosophy that prioritized space optimization and weight reduction over the lessons that the Navy had learned operating Nimitz-class carriers for decades, namely, maintainability. The ability of a crew to quickly and easily access and repair systems under operational conditions was traded against compactness and weight savings, resulting in a system that is harder to fix when it breaks, and breaks more often than the design it replaced. The $400,000 acid flush treatment, which can only be performed in port, is a particularly stark illustration of this problem. A sewage system for a ship that spends most of its life at sea must be maintainable at sea. Yet the Ford system, in its current form, cannot be fully restored without a port visit and an expensive procedure. This represents a design acknowledgement that the system was not adequately engineered for the operating environment it would face. The Government Accountability Office, Congress's investigative arm, has published multiple reports over the years documenting the cost overruns, schedule delays, and reliability problems that have characterized the Ford program. These reports have been available to defense policymakers for years, documenting in careful bureaucratic language exactly the pattern of problems that the sewage crisis represents. New technology introduced faster than it could be validated, operational problems that were foreseeable but not prevented, and a procurement system that struggled to apply the lessons of experience to the design of the ship meant to replace the previous generation. Behind the engineering analysis and the procurement critique is the human reality of what 4,500 to 5,000 sailors experienced during 9 months at sea on a ship with a broken sewage system. Waiting 45 minutes to use a toilet is not an abstraction. It is a daily humiliation and an operational burden that falls most heavily on the junior sailors who have the least control over their circumstances and the fewest resources for coping with them. Hull technicians working 19-hour shifts to manage a plumbing crisis are sailors who are not sleeping, not recovering, and not maintaining the level of physical and mental readiness that safe naval operations require. The Navy's own investigation into the losses of FA-18 jets from the USS Harry S. Truman during her extended Red Sea deployment concluded that high operational tempo and crew fatigue were contributing factors, and the situation on the Ford was, by every account, at least as stressful. The Navy has a retention problem, and the Ford's extended deployment, its sewage crisis, and the broader pattern of operational overextension are contributing to that problem in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. A sailor who leaves the Navy because of their experience on the Ford takes with them years of training, experience, and institutional knowledge that will take years and significant expense to replace. Regarding the Iranian information warfare dimension, the claim that the Ford's retreat was forced by the sewage failure and fear of Iranian or Houthi forces is propaganda, designed to serve specific audiences. Iranian domestic opinion, Iranian proxy forces, and international audiences sympathetic to the narrative of American imperial overreach being successfully resisted. The Ford did not flee. She participated in Operation Epic Fury and supported the campaign. However, dismissing the Iranian information campaign entirely would be a mistake, as it is operating in an environment where the Ford sewage crisis provided genuinely embarrassing material. A $13 billion warship with broken toilets and a crew that has been at sea for 9 months and is considering leaving the Navy is not the image the world's most powerful Navy wants to project, regardless of whether the ship's flight deck is still functional. The embarrassment is real, and the story will persist long after the Ford returns to Norfolk and the systems are repaired. This story will be cited in future analyses of American military readiness, in debates about defense procurement, and in the information campaigns of America's adversaries. Comparing the Ford's experience with previous deployments is important, as context matters when evaluating the severity of the problem. Extended deployments are not entirely new. During the Cold War, carriers regularly spent 7 to 8 months at sea. The difference is the combination of factors: the sewage system failure coinciding with an extended deployment, coinciding with a combat operation, coinciding with the highest profile military campaign the United States had conducted since the Iraq War. The Navy's current posture, operating 11 aircraft carriers, means that when multiple simultaneous crises demand presence, in Ukraine, China, and the Middle East, the solution historically has been to extend the deployments of carriers already in position. While the Ford's specific technical problems can be fixed, the question is whether they will be addressed properly with sustained attention and investment, or with temporary fixes that allow the problem to recur. The Navy has known about the VCHT system problems for years. What has been lacking is not information but priority, the institutional willingness to invest the time, money, and shipyard access required to fundamentally rebuild the system rather than applying temporary treatments. Broader reforms to the Ford-class procurement and maintenance process are also overdue, and lessons should be systematically incorporated into the design and construction of her sister ships, the USS John F. Kennedy, the USS Enterprise, and the USS Doris Miller, all of which are at various stages of construction or commissioning. The question of deployment length, and whether 9-month deployments of ships with known maintenance problems in active combat theaters are acceptable management of resources, deserves serious attention from Congress and defense leadership. The gap between the $13 billion embodiment of American naval supremacy and the broken plumbing that made it a global punchline is the gap where this story lives. The USS Gerald R. Ford did not retreat because of a toilet, but the crisis is not just an embarrassing anecdote. It is a window into systemic problems in naval procurement, deployment management, and the treatment of the sailors who carry the weight of American military commitments.